Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar today on the future for public services. So we will be, taking a little look into the future. I'm Sarah Castell. I'm Head of Futures at Ipsos MORI. Head of Futures is an interesting job title to have this year. There's been an awful lot of future around, and I'm delighted to have today with me Gideon Skinner, who's our Head of Political Research as well. Gideon, do you want to introduce yourself quickly before we start?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. I've been working at Ipsos MORI. We were just discussing for far too long to remember I'm our head of political research, so I've had an exciting few years. But with my other hat on, I'm also responsible for our public services research. It looks at cross-cutting issues like public service reform, trust, stakeholder engagement, customer satisfaction, those types of issues. So that's partly where I'm coming in for today.
So we wanted to get together to think about what we know about public services and public opinion. So Gideon will take us through some of that, and I will talk about some of our foresight approaches and how we can apply them to looking at the future for public services. I've been at Ipsos a long time as well, about 15 years. I've spent my career there developing things where publics and stakeholders can come together to think about the challenges of the future. So I set up our public dialogue centre and more recently our foresight practice. So that's why we are well placed to think about the future and excited to be doing so with you. We have, I guess, not just our own knowledge and experience, but we are supported in the analysis that we're doing today by our wealth of data and thought leadership. I'm sure some of you have read some of these. Please read more of them. They're all great. But I think to think about the future, we need not only our opinion surveys, but what we know about global trends, what we know about the differences between generations, tracking technology and connected health and sustainability and all the other great stuff that we look at. So we're going to hopefully try to roll all that in today to a short look at what might happen in the future. And we're going to do this in three parts, a 3-act play. The first part will be me talking about what COVID has changed and what it's accelerated and altered about our state at the moment, our public life and people's opinions. So this isn't necessarily based on survey data, but this is based on looking at the signals that we see all around us in the culture, the innovations, the behaviours that have changed during the pandemic and after. And we have a particular sort of framework that we use to look at what COVID has revealed and also what it's accelerated and how it's changing the world that we live in. So that gives us a start point for thinking about what the future might look like for public services, what the context might be. Then Gideon will take you through a lot of great data about the evidence from what the public thinks. What did we think before the pandemic, and what do we think now that it's underway, and what can we look to for the future, and what are people's expectations of government and the state? And then we have a short section at the end, really on the implications on the kind of world that this might give rise to. A lightning approach to doing a bit of scenario planning in the last 5 minutes, which is going to be fun, and then some conclusions. So yeah, do feel free to listen and enjoy. If you have questions as you go through, please put them in the chat box, and we'll have a look at them at the end, and we will try to get through as many as we can. If we can't get to you, we'll come back to you separately on email afterwards and hope to answer your question there. And we'll also send around a recording of this as well after the event, so don't feel you have to take a lot of notes, but please feel free to share that recording when you get it. So to begin, what has COVID-19 changed about the way we live? And when we horizon scan the next 3 to 5 years, as I said earlier, this is a technique we use. What has COVID revealed? What has it accelerated? And a start point for this really is that we can look at the challenges that were there already, the global challenges that we knew society would be facing, and the certainties that we know are coming down the track. And I think COVID has revealed, as a society, the UK's sort of lack of resilience to some of those challenges. So, the ageing society is not a new thing. People know it, people talk about it. But I think the reality of the demographic time bomb has kind of hit our public life a bit more now. We know what it looks like when we have to ration care for groups of people and be concerned about that, and we know what it might be like if all our pensions get devalued in a forthcoming recession, and what the impact might be. So that kind of shift, I think, in awareness is coming forward now. We also know that the global challenges coming down the track include probably more seismic climate events and health events. You know, some people are saying that this is only the practice pandemic, and there might be another one even worse in a year or two. And it's been well known in international risk management and risk analysis for the last few years that, you know, these once in 20-year floods and heat waves are happening closer and closer together. So we can probably expect something else, maybe not of comparable size and scale, but things with impact are going to carry on hitting our society, and we haven't really thought about how we prepare for these in enough detail. And also, you know, this isn't necessarily something that is at top of mind for people. Gideon will talk about what worries the world and what people are saying that they're bothered by. But actually, in the background, there are these themes coming forward. The Chinese-American Cold War, tech war. The UK has said that we're not having Huawei in our 5G systems, and there's a sort of global rupture coming about how we structure and regulate the internet. And actually, in a world where we might rely on that infrastructure more, and we might rely on digital more, and public services obviously having to rely on digital a lot more and will do in future, then this is something that we ought to take note of, perhaps in our planning. Although how we do that is a harder question. So I think this all reveals our need for resilient public services. And when we talk to public service leaders during the pandemic, we hear lots of stories around, I think, maybe having a feeling of having more permission to collaborate and to create more sort of nuanced supply chains and more flexibility. So there's both a need to do it and a flexibility and permission to do it. So, collaborating between public, private sector, charity sector, just to make sure that services carry on existing and all citizens can access them in the crisis now and in future. We've seen how quickly and flexibly we need to act to really be resilient. We know that we need to create better supply chains and better ways to sort of solve problems as they occur. We've seen what it looks like when we run out of toilet paper. What might it look like if we run out of food or medicine in a future scenario or situation? How can we flex now to accommodate that? I guess that's what COVID reveals, I suppose, about what we knew was happening already. But COVID is also accelerating some of our expectations and some of our norms in society, and particularly around delivery and speed of services. Digital transformation, it's an existing trend. We've all been wanting to do more of it, services moving this way for a long time. But actually the private sector has really done some leapfrogging in the last 3 months. There's been loads of things launched, like in financial services, you might have Samsung launching kind of different wallets, or Snapchat launching ways to do new things within its app that kind of bring interfaces together. There's a lot of work we've done on this. We can talk about this on other occasions, but I think the sort of expectations of fluidity and liquid expectations across categories mean that even though people know public services are going to be delivered more online and more digitally, the kind of normal expectation has raised the bar a bit. And also in a kind of slightly different space, speeding up of science has become a more acceptable thing. The discussion about vaccines, we're all going to be a big fourth stage trial of the delivery of vaccines and how they work within a population, I imagine. And the capacity for public and private sector collaboration has increased. There's more interest, I think, in transformative translational ideas and innovations, and we may see those things rewarded more in future. So what do those expectations mean for public service? Oh, sorry, the screen controller is either too fast or too slow. I apologise. What's accelerated in the delivery of public services? We've all seen ourselves working in a more agile way, teams collaborating, not just within our jobs, but actually across roles as well, and taking more risks, being more experimental, perhaps trimming the fat in things like procurement a little, and the rapid push to online, even things that were super important. I like this Last Supper meme, things that we thought couldn't be done online now can be, and that's probably likely to stay now that kind of boundary has been set and has moved forward. Another trend that has accelerated through COVID is the scrutiny of the structures on which our society is based. And this seems quite sort of highfalutin, and what's it got to do with service delivery, but it's quite quite clear that people have seen inequality consolidating. If you're rich and you've got a nice upstairs office, I've got a lovely bedroom that I can sit and talk to you in, but members of my team might have to work sitting on their bed in a flat share because they're younger and don't have a house. So there's a generational thing, there's an income thing. If you're poorer, or if you're more likely to be a key worker, you're more likely to be exposed to the virus. All of these themes we've heard being discussed, and of course BAME people being more at risk medically, and also intersectional challenges, meaning perhaps they're more likely to be in the kind of roles that are exposed as well. So in this context, we've all seen activism ramping up and these structural problems as the focus. And I was talking to some American activists recently, and they were saying their main aim for the next 2 years is to keep this inequality structural link front and center of people's minds. So hopefully that link won't go away, because it's important, but I think it also means that we will all be scrutinized a lot more. And this is also in the context of awareness of the polarized information landscape that we have, that it used to be the case, maybe I got a different Facebook page from my mum, but maybe that didn't matter. But now actually, if I'm getting different news about the virus, or different science, or different interpretations of studies, or differently politicized discussions of important health issues, then those bubbles that we're all in become more visible, and there's more debate about what to do about them. So, what does this mean if you're delivering public services? You'll probably need to be accountable from more angles. So, you have to not just walk the walk, but be actually treating your workforce well. You have to not just talk about sustainability, but actually being sustainable. This is a website, which high street shop should get your money. This was a site saying who's doing well. Are you someone who's furloughing your staff in a dodgy way, or making them work in warehouses that aren't very sanitary conditions, and maybe people can withdraw their money from you. And so it's that kind of, you don't have just the ordinary authorities marking your work anymore. There will be a lot more accountability and a rapid scrutiny. And this links in, I think, with the need to focus on the lived experience of citizens, of diverse citizens, and listening to different stories and designing services to meet their needs. In the era of Black Lives Matter, we can't ignore that need to hear different experiences. And also, we may need to help citizens to navigate the information and evidence they get more than ever. And this is all quite close in. This is what we might need to do in the next couple of years. But being a futurist, I also like to look quite far out to the furthest horizon, and look at what's changing about society even more broadly. And I think that the COVID might transform in the long term. It could have quite a transformational effect on our view of what society is all about. The transforming trends that we see include very fluid boundaries. We're working from home, and Gideon's lovely daughter is joining him in the room and during this very call, and we're having to all manage our home and our work and our entertainment. But similarly, the way that commercial entities are talking to us in this way, and giving us the chance to flick between different states and different places, is happening more and more rapidly. And as I said earlier, yesterday's good is today's average when it comes to dealing with your life in the round, and dealing with your life in a holistic way. So that might change, like who we think we are, who we are when we're at work, who we are at home, all the rest of it. And this is always a good quote for an afternoon seminar when we've all had our lunch. What is freedom? I'm sure you got up this morning thinking about that. But you might have got up and read some tweets about people who don't want to wear masks and people who do want to wear masks in shops, or you might have thought about what's happening in different countries around the world as they navigate different forms of authoritarian government and that kind of thing. So we may have a kind of bigger debate about what can we expect and what should we do for others. And finally, I think we've had quite a profound shaking to our sense of dominion over the natural world. We're not all that. We can be laid low by a tiny virus, and we're not able to control the effects of it all. So these might have longer term profound shifts. But it may not affect the library opening hours immediately, but it may be shifting the Overton window. And when you come to talk to your citizens and think, how do we engage with them? How do we engage with deliberative democracy? How do we enable this scrutiny and enable this sort of visioning with the citizens that we need to do? We might see some different kind of assumptions growing, maybe different debates on the way we use data and the way we use the digital world to work together as a society. We may want to renegotiate what we mean by freedom. There may be new ways of valuing the natural environment, and veganism might get a big boost from the fact that we are all slightly more humbled by our place in nature. Or there may be a race to reassert our dominance. I mean, we may want to kind of get back on the horse and carry on trying to be in charge of the natural world. So these are bigger, longer term trends, and they can be folded into the sort of social contract perhaps further down the line. And on that kind of large note, I will hand you back to Gideon, who will talk about what do people say they want, and what do we know about their desires and their opinions.
Okay, thanks very much, Sarah. I hope you enjoyed our little interruption, but we're just trying to sort out some homeschooling at home in this new world. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm going to try to give you a quick overview of maybe where public opinion was about public services in that brief period of time, if you can still remember it, when it looked like we had at least had a plan for dealing with Brexit, but before the COVID pandemic hit us, and what the challenges facing public services were, and then of course see how that shifted over the last few months with the advent of the pandemic. But I mean, of course, if we go back to where we were even before the coronavirus, we already knew that public services were facing a kind of a number of pressure points. Some of these Sarah has already mentioned. We had the aging population, the impact that had in terms of meeting that rising demand, the demands for the workforce, which in itself was then having a knock-on effect through some implications for Brexit and what that means for recruiting staff, for other regulatory changes, the uncertainty maybe it's brought to the economy, all against a backdrop of a decade or so of austerity and what that's meant for public services and how they were delivered. And we see all of that kind of playing through in some of our data. The issues index that many of you will be aware of started, without giving away my age too obviously, the year that the month indeed that I was born in 1974. We saw, and as of course you knew, that Brexit was dominating public concerns just as much as it was dominating legislative and political attention over the last few years. But around the time of the election and just after, it was beginning to fall back down again, to be kind of replaced by other issues, some of which probably, like the NHS, frankly really had never gone away. There was a brief period when it was less a concern for people, but the 2019 general election was not just a Brexit election. There are a number of other issues going through, although of course we can't be so naive as to think that Brexit is all done and dusted. That applies to the public as well. Around 6 in 10 think that it's unlikely we'll leave the transition period with a trade deal. Only 1 in 4 think we'll leave with a good trade deal for Britain. But even before the pandemic, we were seeing a number of other issues sort of bubbling away under the surface. We were seeing a return in concern around crime, law and order. If we think maybe back to the 90s and the ASBO New Labour days, we've got crime with a focus on knife crime in particular was coming back. We had concern about housing, particularly in urban areas and for younger people. We had completely spontaneously a new concern coming up, so that we had to create a new code for it called lack of faith in government and politics. We had some of the highest levels of concern about the environment that we'd ever seen, and in response to austerity, concern about poverty and inequality. And there's probably other things we could put on there as well in the health context, particularly social care and mental health services, for example. But all of these were big issues anyway, and even once we get past this immediate crisis, they're not going to go away either, even if they don't have quite the same focus as they once did. Thinking about the kind of the green recovery, and how we're going to build our way out after the coronavirus. The public is very keen to make sure that we don't lose that kind of environmental focus. They want people to prioritize, or the government to prioritize, sectors like renewable energy, energy efficiency, clean transport, and so on, over some more sort of traditional manufacturing sectors. So that's going to be crucial. So we had all these kind of bubbling away of a multitude of different concerns, all of which kind of particularly in the context of a long period of economic pessimism and the uncertainty and divisions created by Brexit, that kind of had meant that kind of really overall the public mood had been one of kind of national fatigue, really. I mean, particularly since the 2015 election, a general sense of dissatisfaction with the way things were going, a sense that many people felt neglected and weren't getting their fair share. 4 in 10 people saying that they think their local area gets less than its fair share of infrastructure spending, and that being focused particularly outside London and the southeast, so in the devolved nations, but also in the kind of the classic, what we've all come to know as the red wall areas, where the Conservatives made many gains in the 2019 election. And then the sort of similar parallel concern was rising worries about social mobility. Back in 2008, around about half the population felt that people had enough equal opportunities to get ahead, but 10 years on, that had fallen to just 1 in 3. And of course, in response to the Black Lives Matter protests and greater focus on those, even though our long-term trend data shows that Britain generally is becoming a bit more liberal, a bit more of an open country, there's still these concerns about kind of persisting structural inequality. So around about 3 in 10 people saying that they think Britain's public services treat Black and Asian people worse than white people. And all of this kind of feeds into the concerns for public services, and what's going to be done, and what are the priorities, and what the public's experiencing and wanting. And probably kind of the big overarching of all of these is a swing back against austerity. There was a period in the later period of the new Labour reign and the immediate response to the financial crash, where there was a sense that government and public services had done too much, and people wanted it to be reined back. But that sort of pendulum has swung back the other way, and now there's definitely a sense that people want increased spending on public services. They even say, at least, that they are prepared to pay more in taxes to pay for that. And that's feeding through into people's experience of public services, direct experience of public services. So over the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen fewer people saying that public services understand their needs, listen to their preferences, collaborate, involve people, or give people a personalized service. And those numbers were never very high. People had sort of high expectations of public services, particularly around these public service reform issues. But there's kind of concerns that they're getting worse in response to what's happening in austerity. And in some ways, kind of, if we go back to what people just really want from their public services, I'm going to show you a couple of questions here that we only asked at the end of last year, but to be honest, we probably could have asked at any time over the last 10 to 20 years, and we would have got similar answers. I mean, what do people want from health services? They want more staff, they want easy access, shorter waiting times, up-to-date technology, supportive staff. When it comes to crime, people want more police on the beat, better parenting, better discipline in schools, more activities for young people. Now, obviously, the mechanisms and the models of all these have changed a great deal over the last few years, and some things have changed, but fundamentally there's still a sense that people want kind of good quality local public services, well staffed, and from staff who are sympathetic and empathetic towards them, that they can have access to, and they get what they want speedily. And that comes through in the sort of the sense of people's lived experience of public services, which particularly in our qualitative work is coming through really strongly. 4 in 10 say that their own experiences and those of their family and friends are more important than statistics. And coming from someone who deals with this, it's something that we have to be very, very aware of. It's a very clear sense that in many local areas, people just don't buy that their public services are getting better. And in the context of all that, of course, COVID strikes with kind of immediate impact. It sort of really reshapes people's priorities. I mean, this is from our latest issues index, and 7 in 10 saying that coronavirus is one of the biggest issues facing the country. It was even 8 in 10 the month before. And these are sorts of levels comparable with how many people were concerned about inflation and unemployment in the 80s. It sort of just goes to show how dominant that concern is and how it sort of refocused everything. But it's also brought other things to the fore, particularly concerned about the economy. This wave was also just after the Black Lives Matter protest, so race relations were a concern. But you can see maybe there's a little bit less focus being paid to things like Brexit, NHS, crime, and so on. So if we kind of go on to some of these in particular, I mean, I mentioned the economy. There's been a lot of talk about kind of the economic downturn over the last couple of days. In the month after the lockdown, our economic optimism index showed pessimism about the economy rising to its worst level since the 2008 crash. So that's a real concern for many people, particularly younger people. And then, of course, there are the health impacts in terms of, if we're talking still about the very immediate impacts of the disease, not just the tragic impacts of the disease and the virus itself, but also the longer term impacts in terms of maybe people putting on weight or drinking more than they normally would. I'm sure nobody on this call would dream of doing such a thing, but we are finding that. Mental health impacts, people feeling anxious or lonely, and then sort of the long term impacts, maybe storing up problems for public services down the line, with around 1 in 3 people saying they've postponed medical advice or treatment due to the coronavirus. So not a majority, but still that's a big portion of people who are concerned about what's going on. And of course, we're not out of this yet. Public opinion is still volatile, and we're still trying to deal with uncertainty about what it all means for public services. We saw the proportion of people who were very concerned trickle down as time went past since the lockdown. But then when the announcement that the rules were relaxed, concern popped up again. So we've definitely, the public don't feel like we're out of this yet, and they're pretty apprehensive about it all. They're looking forward to seeing friends and family. Of course they are. They're kind of coping with shopping, but on kind of things like going to large public gatherings, using public transport, using public toilets. Sarah mentioned loo roll before, but people are not using it in public loos. There's kind of big levels of concern. And even some areas, key areas like going back to work or sending your children to school, people are getting more used to the idea, but there's still a reasonable minority, 1 in 3 or so, saying they're uncomfortable.
I think we might have lost Gideon. Are you there, Gids, or have you crashed?
Said they were
no,
likely to wear a face mask, but when we said, but what happens if the government recommended that you should, that kind of more than doubles. And generally the public has been quite kind of supportive of the big measures that the government has been taking in terms of trying to support the economy and increase funding for public services. So that people are looking for government to take a lead, and that's partly because they're expecting big changes. They're expecting changes to not just the economy, but the way we live our lives, and of course Britain's public services themselves to happen as a result of the coronavirus. And kind of Sarah's already talked about some of these, and we'll give you some scenarios at the end. It's kind of interesting that the area where they're expecting less change is in the British system of government, which maybe reflects some of that cynicism and disengagement towards politics that I referred to earlier. But if we go into some of the specifics and what that might mean, we've talked about the kind of the digital transformation, but people expecting to use technology more to get in touch with public services, to just spend more time generally online, to maybe be a bit more focused on their home areas, on their local areas. And on the other side of that, maybe certainly much less likely to be traveling abroad, and even for some people not really looking forward to using their car as much either, although that raises additional questions. So if we go back to those original pressure points facing public services, we can see how COVID is sort of both accelerating and sort of exacerbating some of those problems that we're already facing, of course, in terms of cost and economic uncertainty and rising demands, but impacts on the workforce, how we're going to deal with this now sort of accelerating move to tech solutions and the potential inequalities that that drives. Of course, the relationship between the much bigger levels of government spending and austerity, and different areas like devolution and the kind of, the opportunities and the difficulties that that throws up, that people are going to have to deal with. Having said all that, and I'm going to finish now, just to leave you on one slightly more positive note before Sarah finishes. People are confident in most public services that they will be able to adapt. We have seen a bit of a rallying around the kind of the key institutions of public life, certainly the NHS, but a lot of positivity around schools, the police as well. I mean, even care homes, although there are more concerned about that, as there are for other areas, particularly, for example, benefit provision, or the centre of government. So there's concerns there, but generally people are hopeful that public services can react. And now Sarah can talk about maybe some of the scenarios that you might be facing.
Good stuff, thank you. So we've heard about the trends that are pushing our society in various different ways. We've heard about public expectations and public opinions, and where we came from, how we came into this pandemic. And I suppose the final piece of the puzzle is the how we do it. We may all say we want great locally delivered public services by lovely sympathetic people, but the how do we do it, how do we pay for it, and how does that fit in the context that we that we find ourselves in, how these tensions are going to play out. So what I'm going to try and do for just the last couple of minutes is do a punt on what will 2025 look like. Scenario planning, we do a lot of it in our trends and futures practice. It's very useful because it helps us structure often completely contradictory drivers that could be pushing us in different directions. It's not necessarily to predict which world might happen. There are 4 quadrants here which I'll talk about, but we're not expecting any one of them to be the dominant one, but it helps us structure our discussions now, and it could help you perhaps if you're thinking about how you deliver services or how you structure yourselves going forward. It's a useful thought experiment to say, well, what if this world happens, or what if a world more like that one happens? How can we be ready for it, and are there common themes that we need to be prepared for, to be adaptive to whatever world comes to pass? So some quite obvious sort of dimensions to build the future on. The up and down y-axis is about really the economy. Do we recover quite smoothly? Is the virus under control? Do we have an easy winter? Then therefore lots of commercial pressure and social pressure to return to the high touch economy that we had in the past. People meeting together and being able to deliver goods and services in the traditional manner. Or do we have a probably less desirable patchy recovery, a patchy global recovery, and a national level one, where perhaps we might see local level lockdowns and the virus returning strongly, lots of other and tragedies and sadnesses in our healthcare system with people dying, and the low touch economy carrying on. So that's sort of one big dimension. We can't have both, it'll either be one or the other. And the other dimension, the x-axis horizontally, is an interesting way of looking at the kind of prevalent values that might be emerging in the next few years. So I'll show you in a minute our global trends survey data from before the pandemic, but this x-axis kind of reflects that, really, that in the pandemic there is, when we've seen it all ourselves, a desire to return to the old normal, perhaps a slightly more hedonistic approach to life, a judgment of risk about what's the risk to me and mine, rather than looking more broadly. And perhaps a sort of intellectually robust position, saying, like, if we all just kind of improve our own lot, then things will get better. And then you also always have the other side of this chart, which is opinions around how we could use this opportunity to perhaps improve our socialization of risk, or to improve our resilience by looking more globally. This is the end of the chart where you see the sort of capitalism 2.0, globalism 2.0. How do we reconfigure the world that we're in for the future? So those are kind of two dimensions. And again, they're not going to be, the future's not going to be one or the other. There'll be elements of both, but they could pull us in different directions. And as I said, I just wanted to show you a bit of our global trends survey data. We did this obviously before the pandemic, and we are going to do a review of some of this and perhaps update some of these values to see whether anything has changed and how quickly they change. But there are 36 global values, clusters of opinions, and they tend to move together. So if you are in this sort of optimistic, open, bluish green blob at the top, you're probably more likely to be pro-globalism and to want to live all around the world and to be insta shopping and looking at reviews online, that kind of thing. Those are sort of opinions that tended to hold together, and people tended to have the same sets of attitudes. And actually, you can see those more hedonistic kind of traditionalist attitudes on the conserving side, and then on the change side, things like wealth redistribution and regulating big tech and being concerned about the climate and that kind of thing. So I think this is speculation at this stage. This is my expert speculation, but I think what we might see after the pandemic is an opening up of some of those radical ideas to include some of the ideas from the optimistic group that perhaps people might see. Ways of changing the world a little bit, but that may be present in society. It doesn't mean it'll be driving society, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's good or bad. It just means that those values might be there. So if you map what 2025 could look like, you could have a world where we're economically not too badly off, and we are slightly more protectivist in the way that we think about ourselves, either as a nation or as individuals. We're probably not very resilient to global shocks because we've done nothing different to 2019. We're just sort of waiting for the next occasion. But we could be in growth. We could make strides with our digital transformation, and think about how that could benefit the UK as a nation in that way. We could also have a possibly slightly more nostalgic future, perhaps where we focus in on our regions. I mean, we call it nostalgic, but actually it could be quite forward thinking as well, because we could be thinking about how to rejuvenate urban and rural spaces using the low touch economy. There'll be more virus and less money around in this future, but there'll be ways that we try and kind of capture our local communities and serve them well. Or, if you have this slightly more change-oriented attitude in society, and we have the economic resilience to do this, you might see those values of scrutiny of government and business coming to the fore, a demand for collaborative public and private business models, new ways of thinking about shareholder value that's not just about shareholders but about the green recovery as well. Excuse me, as well, and that might enable us to do more on the policy side in those directions. Or we may see a world which perhaps is within a broader global context of probably slightly more creative destruction, that maybe this might be in a world where there are more global shocks. There's more of the sort of culture war. There's more tension between governments and their citizens. But even so, we're in the low touch economy still. We're still going to have to deal with the virus. There'll still be an appetite for innovation and risk taking and tech driven innovation. And we may have to rethink service provision and make some tough decisions about resourcing, but we can make them with a sort of future oriented mindset. So those are four possible, very, very quickly sketched out futures. We would normally spend a bit longer doing this sort of thing. But again, they may all shape what we call the Overton window for what citizens accept and like in policy making. So the Overton window, I think someone's asked in the chat for me to confirm what that is. It's the set of ideas which are publicly acceptable in policy at any given time, and it can move about as some things become more acceptable and other things become less. So if it opens up, it means you've got more policy room to play with. So these are some ideas for 2025. And so coming right to the end of this webinar now, we tried to pull together some of the things we think will be the touchstones for the new normal for public services. You know, whatever direction those trends take us, whatever world we create, and based on what people want, it will be a world where we will need to collaborate more. Between and among and between different sectors. Conceptions of value will have changed. It'll now be about treating the diversity of service users well and being aware of the rapid scrutiny. There won't be one authority marking your work, as we said. There may be more scope for things like talking about our differences and what brings us together. You know, deliberative democracy might be on the rise, I think, or be something that we need to bring in. I think the rapid move to technology we've talked about quite a lot all throughout, but you know, whether it's applying a kind of customer experience approach to much more of the delivery of public services, and the citizen journey with many different touch points will be important, I think, although we of course need to address equality of access. We'll need to be flexile and agile, or even flexible and agile, because the output for the service users will be a more kind of coherent, joined up service. And something else to put in at the end that we haven't, Gideon's mentioned a little about housing and transport, but I think this is a really good opportunity to engage the public on thinking about particularly urban areas and how we live. You know, it's not just working at home or, you know, homeschooling, but there are some big debates about, you know, what do we want for the future of transport? What do we want for the future of our cars, for local planning, for national level planning, for quality of life priorities? And so this brings us back again to this sort of regional and local visioning of how our priorities should be developed. And we think it's really important to involve citizens in that. So that's where we came out. If you'd like to talk in future about informing your strategy with future scoping, we have a lovely brochure that you're welcome to read, which covers some different approaches, and me and my team are obviously always happy to talk about this. But it's something I think that can really help with strategy building in uncertain times, and I think it helps us all feel that we're part of the future, and we are not, if not in control of the future, we're certainly part of the ecosystem of the future, and we can help to shape it. So with that thought, I will finish up. Thank you. There we go.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I think we are finishing very shortly. We did have a couple of questions. We had one question from Richard, a councillor, so thank you very much for that, about people's willingness and ability and capacity to shift to using digital more in their lives. I mean, I think there's probably 2 points to make on this. I mean, actually willingness is reasonably high. You know, for example, if we're talking about people downloading the smartphone app, you know, there's broad support for downloading a smartphone app for contact tracing or for things like that, and people are generally confident that they can probably make it work, but certainly there is still the kind of the skepticism that we would have seen a year or two ago about the privacy concerns. How is it going to be used? Who is going to see the data? And particularly if there's any sort of sharing with the private sector, that's likely to raise extra levels of concern. And certainly, you know, that's definitely going to be different for different groups of the population. You know, we know obviously older groups, lower income groups, more vulnerable groups are much less likely to have access to the internet. So I think broadly what the public are looking for are kind of a big range of ways to be able to get in touch with the public services that kind of reflects their modern lives and has a choice, but they're much less keen if that means shutting any of the old ways down, particularly if that then has unequal impacts in terms of accessibility.
Yeah, and I think I would add something about the shift to digital is it's not just about moving the public services that we have to digital, because people with more wealth and social capital and infrastructure around them will be better at dealing with public services all round and will be better at getting what they want out of them. And so actually they'll also be better at dealing with the digital platform, whether it's you know, an effective interface or not. And so I think the citizen experience and, you know, making sure that we scaffold the people who are least able to deal with it, it's just a good principle anyway, and digital just gives us another opportunity to do that. I think we might be running out of time for other questions, but we will look at anything else that we've received and respond to people individually. I hope you've enjoyed today, and yes, enjoy the rest of your day and your week, and thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.